Hi everyone, today I want to talk about my Shards Conjuration Sorcerers. This is the build I've played the most on a Sorcerer so far. I leveled almost entirely from like 1 to 100 with this, and I had a pretty good time with this. So the idea behind this is that you use Shards for single target damage and to just defeat enemies, and you trigger Frost Novas that then again cast automatic Ice Shards at all nearby frozen enemies. And the way to do that is that I have all three conjuration skills. You see here I have Hydra, Ice Blades, and the Lightning Spear on the bar. And whenever they hit enemies, they have a chance to trigger 3 Frost Novas. So you kind of just like walk through the dungeon and everything explodes. This footage that you're seeing here is pre-patch 1.1.1, where this build actually gets a sizable buff, in particular in defenses, which this build has like almost none of anyway. And the damage is also a bit increased with some of the aspect buffs. So this is actually going to be a bit better than what you're seeing here. In this run, this is a tier 87 that I've done after already clearing a tier 100. I was just like trying to find a bit of like a comfortable farming level. Tier 100 was not exactly comfortable with such a low amount of defenses, no flame shield, no ice armor. Obviously this is a very squishy setup and I was playing on hardcore on top of that, so I had to be a bit careful. But it worked, and especially on the lower end, especially for farming and leveling, this was actually a pretty solid build. Now the thing is that these Frost Novas are not always so consistent, so the way this works is that your conjuration skills just trigger them, randomly on a lucky hit, and that doesn't happen all too frequently if you have not fully invested into lucky hit. That's also why when you're about to see the setup, you'll see I have a lot of lucky hit investment. There's like lucky hit on the passive tree, there's the wand base, there's some stuff on the paragons. All in all, I was running with like something like 200% lucky hit or something like that. So a quite massive amount. And then it started feeling somewhat smooth, especially once a bit of like extra mana cost reduction and an extra cooldown reduction came in later on. But the 3 Frost Novas are definitely useful because basically every time the Frost Nova happens, everything gets frozen, and then the automatic Ice Shards from the Ice Shard enchant just destroy everything around you. And in between, just cast your own Ice Shards to deal damage as well and to defeat the bosses. And you saw in this clip here I was running with the Barber heart, which is like one of the most prominent hearts in the season right now. It's very powerful, but I also tried it without. So for example here I actually switched off the Barber heart after doing the first half of the boss, and you see you can still do damage, it still works. I was trying this at various stages, I was playing without the Barber just fine, but obviously it elevates it to a higher level a little bit later on when you have that. Now let's walk you through the setup. We have a default planner here, so I made this while I was playing the build and I optimized it a little bit. I have the 50 to 100 speed farming variant, so that's what I was doing most of the time. Then we have T100 push, so I did a few tweaks there. Uber Lilith, where, if you want to fight Lilith, you can do that. And then we have the Codex power only setup for level 50. So if you're leveling this from 1 to 50, you want to work towards this setup here. Now, generally, they are all quite similar. We have those 2 enchantment slots that I mentioned, Frost Nova to trigger automatic Frost Novas, and Ice Shards. And the skill tree looks like this. So Ice Shards is our main damage skill. We have the Greater Ice Shards, where you deal extra damage when you have a barrier active, because the Frost Novas trigger all the time and they make enemies vulnerable with the mystical Frost Nova upgrade. There's the other one, Destructive Ice Shards, that you could run maybe for like the highest tiers if you want to do tier 100s or so, but it should not be necessary. So I was going with that for extra damage. Then we have those few typical skills. So it's the Teleport, Frost Nova, all of the 3 Conjuration skills. I only invested 1 point into each of them because they are mostly there as a supporting option. They're not really the main damage. Now there is a bug with Hydras right now, in particular the Summoned Hydra with the burn effect that makes this build a bit stronger than it should be, at least on the higher tiers. So when I was doing T100 pushes, the Hydra actually did contribute a bit of like noticeable damage, but I wasn't really investing into Hydra to make this like good or anything, and I was actively trying to avoid to kill stuff with Hydra. Basically what happens is Hydra is bugged and it scales the burn damage with the tier or the level of the monster. So you can kind of clear tier 1 the same time as a T100 by just using Hydra, because it scales up its damage. A bit like the Conduit Shrine or something. So it's very weird and not intended, but this is what happens right now, but there's no way around it with this build. So if you want to have a bug-free build, I guess you have to live with this. In the end, it didn't really contribute much. Even on my T100, it was maybe doing something like, yeah, 10 to 20% of the damage or so, like something like that. So even if that gets fixed, it wouldn't really matter for this build in particular. Just wanted to highlight that. Here's the ice blades. I only have the enhanced ice blades because both the upgrades don't really do anything, and the lightning spear with the stun, so that also helps you to just like crowd control enemies. So you see that there's no defenses in this, there's no flame shield, no ice armor, and the constant frost novas triggering from those conjuration skills and also the stun from the lightning spear help you to survive. So this is basically your defense is in the crowd control. And then, for example, in some setups you can also run something like Shared Misery. So I have this here on the boots, for example, in the Codex setup. You could even put it into some of the other setups here instead of the Frost Blitz, for example, or instead of the boots, for example. So there are some options to include Shared Misery, and this makes it so that when you actually freeze an enemy, it will start spreading that freeze or that stun from the lightning spear to other enemies, and then everything gets stunned, and it feels really good when it happens. And that's also already it for the active skills. There's a bunch of passives. So we have all of the cold passives down here. So this is just like the whole cold cluster. We have Devouring Blaze. We get Burn from the Hydras. So generally the way you play this, you like move forward, you cast the Hydra, then you start maybe doing a Frost Nova, or the Hydra triggers a Frost Nova, or maybe use one of the other conjuration skills. You basically just like pop them on cooldown so that you have the lightning spear flying around, you have the ice blades hitting something, and you just trigger Frost Novas for you as you go. And everything just dies as you walk from the automatic ice shards with the ice shard enchantment. And a few other passes are here, like the protection and the mana shield, so just more defense because there's quite little of that in this build. Glass cannon, elemental attunement to reset your frost nova or your teleport, and this is basically it. Here are my item setups. So I have disobedience aspect, extra armor, very nice. We have the frost blitz for the second frost nova charge. So it does give Frost Nova a longer cooldown, but it's kind of situational when you really need it because you have those automatic Frost Nova summon conjuration skills. It's kind of nice to have the second one ready. So for example, in case of a dungeon boss, you can do a Frost Nova and then another Frost Nova 6 seconds later if there's no automatic one. Or just as you walk through a dungeon, you can just use it whenever you need to when there's no triggers happening. But most of the time you have these automatic triggers that just help you out and you don't have to cast it yourself. So it's kind of nice to have the second charge. The piercing cold is the most important aspect, gives you ice shards pierce, and also you can just hit more targets basically behind the main target, gives you more lucky hit procs, etc. It's very important. It's also in the codex, that's very nice. The ever-living aspect is just damage reduction. I ran with Asus Heirloom. You don't need it, but I kind of enjoyed the extra crit chance, so this gives me something like 10 to 13% crit chance or something. Sometimes more when I evade or when I kill an elite. So you have this extra movement speed there. It's kind of nice. But alternatively, it can even run Painted Greaves, or you can run just legendary boots with, for example, Ghostwalker or the Fortune aspect that gives you extra lucky hit while you have a barrier up. So this is also another option to replace this. Here's the Frozen Memories, gives you an extra cast of your Avalanche. So this helps out, especially on the bosses. That's going to be quite important in patch 1.1.1. So you have more mana sustain. You have the Stormstorm aspect, this is getting buffed in the patch, it's going to be 30% extra damage. Then the Control aspect, this gives you more damage against frozen enemies. We have Prodigies, as also in the Codex. You can get mana when you use a cooldown, so almost everything here is a cooldown actually. Just the Ice Shards and the Hydra are not cooldowns, but you have 4 different skills you can use frequently to get mana. And then the Conceited aspect here, so you always have a barrier basically, because even though we don't have ice armor, we run with protection, and there's also a bit of extra duration here. And like this, you just have a barrier basically at all times, unless you take massive damage. In the Codex setup, there's a few tweaks here, so not everything is in the Codex, but it's mostly the same stuff. So I've put something like Eluding here, I put something like Shared Misery here, and Protector aspect, and Elementalists. So the mana sustain may not be the greatest here at the low levels with this setup, but it's essentially the same skill tree. And there's some adjustments here for the T100 push as well. And if you want to do uber bosses with this, which I wouldn't really recommend too much, it's going to be quite tough, but this is what I tried for my sorceress. I did this setup here. So this has Flame Shield, and it doesn't run with Ice Blades, for example, so we don't have exactly that setup. Now for the Paragons, this is actually the funniest Paragon tree that I've ever seen. It's like just this Paragon column basically, but somehow this ended up to be what I had to do. So we have 5 different boards here. Enchanted Master, this is something that is really useful. Enchantments are 20% stronger. I put this quite late in the progression because yeah, before that you want to pick up other stuff, you want to pick up other glyphs, etc. But later on, it definitely helps out to get more of those Frost Nova procs. It gives you like another 6% chance basically to trigger it. I think it makes your ice shards that trigger automatically also deal more damage, but I haven't actually confirmed that. But just for that, it's already kind of nice, and there's a bunch of nice stuff around here. There's the Burning Instinct board. We don't pick up the legendary, we just want the glyph and some stuff on the way. Here's a Frigid Fate board. This is extra lucky hit, and there's also the rare note of extra lucky hit, so you get 25% chance, lucky hit chance, just from this board, plus a glyph on the way, plus vulnerable synergies. We make everything vulnerable all the time, so this is a very powerful board. And here's the Elemental Summoner board, where your Conjuration skills have reduced cooldown. So with all 3 Conjuration skills on the bar, you have 15% less cooldown or mana cost for the Hydra. And it's a really good synergy when you have all 3 here. Plus a bit of extra random stuff. As for the glyphs, we have Destruction here in the starter board, extra crit damage. You can get 39 dex there. We have the Control here with 34 dex on the Elemental Summoner board. Control is pretty powerful, but it doesn't work on the bosses, so I put it here on like the lower value. We have the Exploit glyph with 29 dex, gives you vulnerable damage and also extra damage when you hit enemies that are vulnerable. Then we have Reinforced. This is a rare buffing glyph that also gives you damage reduction while you have a barrier. This is getting buffed in patch 1.1.1 for more damage reduction, including this node as well. So you're gonna get a significant toughness boost here, probably like around 8 to 10% or so just from this board and this glyph alone in the patch. That's gonna be quite nice. And enables the burning synergies here. So the burn comes from the Hydra, which is also a reason why you want to cast the Hydras regularly. And lastly, we have the Territorial glyph here. So this is extra damage and damage reduction from close enemies. Typically, you are kind of close to enemies because you are like right in the middle of the pack to trigger those automatic ice shards and to cast Frost Novas, for example, and then you just like stand there and start casting your skills. So this is a pretty powerful glyph. And the rest is just picking up some, decent rare notes on the way, damage to burn and enemies, damage reduction from elites, vulnerable stuff here on the Frigid Fate board, and yeah, just some other like life or non-physical damage nodes, etc. The stat varieties for this build are nothing really out of the ordinary. It's pretty standard. So you want crit, vulnerable, and then maybe something like resource generation. So here on the ring, for example, also on the offhand, you can get a resource generation. That helps you out a lot in longer combat, like on bosses, for example. Damage reduction, of course, your chest and your pants are very important for those. So just try to stack all of the damage reduction you can. Stack armor, so this combines also with the disobedience aspect, so that you can try to reach high armor values and be a bit more tanky. And everything else is just like extra ranks to skills. Here, for example, the ice shards, lucky hit on the glove, crit, etc. Nothing really special. So the weapon also looks like this with vulnerable damage, crit damage, and then something like all stats and core skill damage, damage to close. These kind of things are all fine. And here you also want to have some cooldown. So on the helm you can get cooldown, on the amulet you can get cooldown, some movement speed to just smooth it out a bit. That's it for the setup. I gotta say, I had a pretty good time playing this build. Now with the patch coming out, I actually have other plans for a Chain Lightning and a Fireball Sorc, so stay tuned for those. I'm actually quite excited to keep going with more sorcerers, but for the most part, it was a fine build, especially on the lower end, especially for leveling up. It felt really nice to play this with those Frost Novas happening and then just like entire screens popping from being frozen and the ice shards like flying everywhere. So I can recommend to try this out. It is definitely a bit on the squishier side of builds, even with the buffs, because, well, the lack of defensive skills. But the offense is actually pretty solid. It's not like a Blizzard Sorc. Blizzard is probably still quite a bit better than this in overall damage output. But yeah, definitely something cool and interesting to play in my opinion. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Wish you good luck with the sorcerers and the patch in general. And I'll see you guys next time.